Good evening, YouTube. A quick intro to what is actually quite a long video, and I'll explain to you in a minute why this thing is over 2 hours long. Don't worry, it's not me 2 hours talking. There's more to this. So, big story and development in the Isle of Man at the moment. The government is planning, considering, thinking of putting an onshore wind farm on the Isle of Man. So, yeah, you heard that right. There indeed is a plan of some sort, very early stages, to put wind turbines in the Isle of Man. Now, the perceptions that I receive of this at the moment from the media and people I talk to is the government's very much in favor of doing it, and the public, well, they've received it about as well as a fart in an elevator. Not a popular idea, and I can't think why. Why would you put these wind turbines on the Isle of Man when we sell this place as, you know, the biosphere, the beautiful countryside, and you plonk these 150-meter tall things there? I'm not the only one asking those questions, and because the government knows that the public has a lot of questions and concerns about this and wants to complain and vent their anger, they done a couple of things. Number one is this, and this was a drop-in center, they call it, or drop-in session. They do a number of those. This one was in the sea terminal in Douglas today, earlier today. There was one, I think there's one in Peel tomorrow, one in Ramsey. It's basically they rock up with a table, a couple of guys explain things, a couple of pictures, and the public can stop by and ask questions. But the bigger thing that they did, and the reason why this video is 2 hours long, is there was a public meeting tonight about this. Also one of a number of public meetings. This one was in Port Erin at the Russian primary school. So I tagged along and recorded the whole thing. So what follows after this short intro is the whole public meeting from tonight. The Chief Minister was there, the MUA guys were there, the consultants that advised the government on this project were there. Public asked questions. So the video basically, at the beginning, there's a number of presentations. I'm going to try and make chapters of them in the description. So I'll check the description to hop to the significant chapters. Now, this can be a bit of a lengthy topic, and it can feel a little bit dry when they go for it. But it does concern the island's energy policy and strategy, and there are some very interesting points in there. So some of you will see this as a sleeping aid and put this video on when you really can't fall asleep, because it's a presentation about sustainability and energy diversity and all that, and whoop, you're going to sleep. Some of you will find it very interesting. It's something that I would recommend you watch and look at, or at least check out their websites. I'm going to try and link to them below what I can find. Key points from this wind turbine project, very early stages, nothing's decided yet. The plan would be anywhere between 3 and 5 wind turbines. At the moment, when you watch the presentation that the one guy gave, how they came up with the currently proposed location for this, it was actually quite intensive. There are only 3 locations that they really considered. All other places in the Isle of Man sort of fell by the wayside for various reasons. It's in the presentation, in the public meeting, and the video that follows. It's quite interesting, actually. So the favorite site, or the proposed site at the moment, is near the Slough, up near, you know, up on the hill there, which of course has quite a visual impact, to put it mildly. They don't know yet what kind of turbines. They don't know how many turbines. I think they want to have 20 megawatts of power there. Plenty of questions to be answered, surveys to be done, environmental impact, all that. So it's early stages, but from the feeling today, and certainly from when you watch the video in a minute, the long public meeting, you will see that most of the public seem against it in the room, and also if you speak island-wide, if you speak to people, they're against it. The government seems to be very much for it. Chief Minister was there, he seems to be for it. To be honest to him, and to be fair to him, he seemed very genuine. He had a few genuine points. You know, one of the points is that we have a very stable energy supply over here, which is important for the economy, because we have a lot of tech industry, data centers, that kind of thing. They need very stable power supplies, which we have at the moment, which we must ensure in future. And we need to diversify our energy supply. The current power station in Douglas and Pulrose, that's going to be due for renewal in about 10 years time. So what's going to follow, right? Are we going to have another gas power station that's going to cost loads and pollute? Are we going to have wind? Why do we have wind on the island? And so on. Plenty of questions to be answered. So he came across as genuine, and I can see his concerns and, you know, why he thinks the way it is. I can see why the public's objecting to it. There's a ton of reasons not to have them on the Isle of Man. Property values going down. We're selling this place for its natural beauty. You can't do that when you stick, as someone put it, industrialize the landscape. So when you stick these big things there, right, the landscape's ruined. So plenty of things pro and con. I'm going to try and link to some of the things below. Also, I took pictures of the thingies they had at the drop-in session. So if you check the description, you have a link to my Twitter feed where I have the pictures of it. Enjoy the 2-hour video that follows, which will give you the whole unedited public meeting from earlier tonight, the various presentations about the project from the MUA and from the consultants. Very strangely, I want to point this out at the beginning of it. It was pointed out to me that the consultants, when they did the presentation there, apparently they had a policy of them not being filmed or wanting to be filmed, but it's okay to film the presentation. First, I was irritated by that, because if you give a presentation at a public meeting and there's, you know, media present and other people present, well, there's no expectation of privacy, so legally I can film you all I want. But I think what I actually meant, thinking about it now, is, you know, they wanted people to focus more on the presentation and not like me showing their mug all the time, which is fair enough. They were very open, they answered questions and everything, so I think it was more like a personal thing than, you know, trying to hide or anything untoward. It came across a bit weird, not wanting to be filmed at a public meeting, but so, you know, I try to be polite, but it is a public meeting, so if you're in a public space, no expectation of privacy. Anyway, enough said. So early stage in this project, as you will see in the video that follows now. Check out the presentations in it. It's quite interesting to see how they decided on the site that I want to use, how they planning for the futures, the energy strategy of the island, which is actually quite, you know, important topic if you think about it. It's dry, it's not very exciting, but it is important, because without a stable energy supply, I think someone said the last time we had a blackout in the Isle of Man was in 1999, which is pretty good. So, you know, we want to keep it that way. So interesting topic, can be a little dry. Check out the public meeting. I'll put chapters in it so you can hop through if you want to go straight to the riots at the end. No, it wasn't riots, it was very polite. You know, people here are upset, but they're upset in a very polite way. So middle class riots, what more do you want? Anyway, here's the video of the public meeting, and I will keep an eye on this topic. So if there are any developments, and you know, this is going to take years for this to happen, if it happens at all, but I will keep an eye on the topic. And here's the public meeting of or about the proposed wind turbines from Russian primary school in Port Erin earlier tonight. And I'll see you next time. And let me know in the comments what you think of the idea of having wind turbines on the Isle of Man. Yes, no, bonkers, good idea? Let me know. Thank you, like and subscribe. See you next time.
A warm welcome to you all tonight. My name is Jane Glover. I'm Deputy Chair of Aubrey and Rushen Parish Commissioners. And on behalf of the Commissioners, I'd like to thank you all for coming tonight. This meeting has been organised so that you, the public, can get to hear firsthand from the panel that's been gathered tonight the reasons behind the selection of Eriestone and Skird as the preferred location for an environmental impact assessment which could lead to the development of a wind farm on that site. It is my pleasure to welcome our panel for you tonight. We have with us the Chief Minister Alfred Cannon, MHK, Minister Tim Pruckle, MHK, DOI Minister and former Chairman of Manx Utilities, Dr Michelle Hayward, representing DEFRA. I think Michelle is here. Okay. From Manx Utilities, we've also got Phil King and Adrian Dobbins. And also with us, we've got John Wannenberg, MHK, who's the new Chairman of Manx Utilities. And from Wardle Armstrong, the consultants, we've got Ian Ramsbottom and Paul Evans. Also, we have Steve Forden, who is the Head of Energy Policy for DEFRA, and Lizzie Riley, who is the Transition Programme Manager for Manx Utilities. I'd now like to hand over to our Chair for the evening, Mr Richard Ronan, who will give you some guidelines on the event's order tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The purpose of the meeting is that the public can hear and engage with consultants and decision makers on this very important and delicate subject. This is common practice on projects of this scale, and would hope that we can all learn and move forward from this debate. I think we can all appreciate the strong feelings the subject of the proposed Manx Utilities wind farm at Eriestone and Skird has generated in recent months, and in fairness on both sides of the debate. This meeting is due to close at approximately 9 p.m, so it's important that the questions asked are not repetitive and not personal. To me as your chair, I would hope this evening that everyone can learn and take as many positives away as we can. I believe there's going to be a presentation from the NUA, and then questions will then be given to the panel from the audience. I got a message from the guys who are running this evening that any mic that goes around, just make sure it goes close to your mouth, so people can hear you. Okay, hand over to the Chief Minister.
Thank you, Richard. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for coming along this evening. My introduction is going to be incredibly brief, but I just wanted to let you know why I'm here tonight. First of all, this is a national project, and of course it has got significant impacts for people in the South, so I think it's important that some form of national representation was made available to you. I won't be able to talk specifically about the site, but I will be able to answer questions about broader policy and how these decisions are being made at a higher level, and I hope give you some background information which you may or may not find useful, but that will be my role here. And also the secondary part of my role here is really to listen and pick up on some of the concerns that I know will be expressed, and I'm certainly be considering those along with the Manx Utilities Authority. This has been a process that's been developing over the last decade or so, but certainly has gathered momentum over the last 5 years. I know that a lot of people, whilst recognising that we have got to sort our energy provision out for the next 25, 30 years, and understand that we have to approach that with consideration and careful thought, also have concerns about the production of renewable energy and the way that that is going to be delivered on the island, and I hope that we can have some discussion around that tonight. But that's enough from me. I'm sure that some of you will have questions later. I'm now going to hand over to Tim Crookall as DOI Minister. Thanks, Tim.
Thank you very much, Chief Minister. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming down this evening to see us, and we'll get your questions later on, no doubt. You may well be aware, of course, that Wardle Armstrong, our consultants, or MUA's consultants, are in the process of carrying out an environmental impact assessment, or an EIA, on behalf of Manx Utilities for a publicly owned onshore wind farm for the Isle of Man. This work forms part of the objectives set within the Island Plan to deliver 20 megawatts of onshore renewables and specifically progress a feasibility study for onshore wind. Importantly, also supports the island's climate action plan and the Isle of Man government's energy plan, and moves us away from the reliance on fossil fuels going into the future. The onshore wind farm element of the objectives set for Manx Utility forms part of a future energy mix, which combines other key elements, will ensure security of supply and cost, as well as sustainability, which remain key priorities for delivery electricity to every home and business on our island. We have prepared several presentations to share with you this evening, which shows our journey from policy setting to strategy developing to delivery. Energy policy and the setting of targets is the responsibility of the Department of Environment, Food and Agriculture. In just a moment, I will invite Steve Forden to present an overview of the policy set by the Isle of Man Government in relation to energy. This policy has been used by Manx Utilities to develop our strategy to meet these policy targets. Lizzie Riley will follow on from Steve to present Manx Utilities' energy transition story as we move towards a fully carbonised electricity system. In order to deliver any major project, detailed site investigations and audits are required to ensure we are progressing down the right path. For an onshore wind farm, the process utilised to demonstrate this is an environmental impact assessment. EIAs are a tool used to assess the significant effects of a project or development proposal on the environment. An EIA has 6 major stages: screening, which identifies the need to carry out an EIA; scoping, which defines what needs to be covered in the assessment and reported in the environmental statement. This stage is currently in progress, as you well know. At the end of the scoping process, a scoping report is submitted for review by statutory consultees, which enables them to comment on the proposed methodology for assessment within the EIA. Until this has been carried out, it is important that statutory consultees do not opine on the site to ensure they do not conflict themselves from the planning process. So it's just a warning that if those that want to comment later on, please do not opine until a certain stage, which is why it is best practice to approach engagement with some degree of caution until this process is complete. After scoping, the full assessment can progress to support the preparation of an environmental study statement. This is also the start of the formal stakeholder engagement process, which is planned for early next year. Once the environmental statement has been submitted, detailed consultation is undertaken to support any future planning application. A decision will then be made on the planning application. Even if the planning application is approved, additional monitoring may still be required to ensure impacts are mitigated as far as possible before proceeding. The burden of proof on any onshore wind planning application is that the most suitable site has been selected. Wardle Armstrong are also here this evening to explain the pathway and the work that has led to an EIA for an onshore wind farm at Erie Stayne and help to demonstrate that this test is met. I hope that their presentation, which covers an audit of every piece of our island landscape, not just those sites in government ownership, helps to provide you with the essential background on why we are focusing an EIA on this location. Could we please retain questions until the end for the panel? And can I please just remind you, those members in this room that are likely to be statutory consultees when the scoping report is completed, so please be careful on when you opine or don't opine on the process to avoid any future potential conflicts for yourselves. That's enough of me. I'm now going to ask Steve, Mr. Forden, to come up on behalf of DEFRA to provide an overview of the policy setting which started this process. Thank you. Good evening, Steve.
Thanks, Minister, and good evening, everyone. So my name is Steve Forden. I'm Head of Energy Policy at DEFRA. I mentioned the DEFRA role because DEFRA have statutory responsibility for planning, so I'm going to talk very specifically about the policy landscape in this context. I can't talk about any particular site, the merits or otherwise of that site, so I'm going to restrict my comments just to the policy setting and leave it at that, I'm afraid, because we want to take the planning side of things incredibly seriously for a project of this magnitude. So I'll talk about the policy. No, not. Sorry? Yeah, it's not doing anything.
How is it? Just do the arrows first. Yeah, do the arrows first.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Next slide, please. It's going to be a picture of a big wind farm, basically, coming up next. That's not it. Next slide. Yeah. Okay, that's it. Great, thanks. So I'm going to talk about the three areas that have set context for our energy policy: climate change, the global shift towards renewable and low carbon, and energy security. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time on each of those before then talking you through what the energy policy and the energy strategy that's published this year says. So next slide, please. So yeah, on the climate change side of things, this is an absolutely fundamental underpinning part of our policy development, and we're guided by what the best and the latest available science says, and that's very much summarised in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change assessment reports, which come out approximately every 6 to 7 years. Back a slide, please. And that's a document that's produced on behalf of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and it's a summary of what the latest science says, essentially, and that's adopted formally by every single government in the world, with the exception of North Korea, and that's their acceptance of what that basic scientific evidence says. And it says fundamentally that we've got a problem. So I took quite a stark quote from the latest assessment report published this year, which is climate change is a threat to human well-being and planetary health, a statement in which the scientific evidence can be asserted with very high confidence, and there is a rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. So I don't want to underestimate the extent to which this climate evidence underpins our thinking here. And so I'm going to just guide you through a few slides on the climate side of things. So next slide, please. So yeah, in practice, what does that look like? Well, it looks like extremes in temperature, as you're seeing on the left, extremes in drought, extremes in precipitation, all of which get incrementally worse with every fraction of warming. We seem to have avoided, through policy action so far, the worst possible outcome of a warming of around 4 degrees, but we're still on target under stated policies of a warming of around 2.5, 2.6 degrees, which is warmer than it's been since around 3 million years ago. And what those figures on the left translate into is figures on the right, which is a range of impact metrics, which are quite substantial and quite significant, from species biodiversity loss at the top. Even at relatively low levels of warming, we're dealing with very significant biodiversity impacts. The most notable between 1.5 and 2 degrees being the complete extinction of all coral reefs in a matter of decades, tropical coral reefs, to a wide range of other impacts, and that's at relatively low levels of warming. We have heat, humidity risk to human health, so that's effectively when it's too hot and too humid for you to be able to sweat properly, or lose heat from sweating, and essentially you can't go outside under those circumstances. We've got food crop impacts, fisheries impacts, and a range of significant metrics that show global warming is a serious problem and it's something we've got to do something about. Next slide, please. Thank you. And although we're on track for avoiding, it seems, through policy action so far, some of the worst possible impacts that we might see at, say, 4 degrees of warming, this last year has been really eye-wateringly warm at a global level. We hit, earlier this month, the first recorded temperature above 2 degrees of pre-industrial warming, which was one day, but it was a stark message, and that the whole year, as you can see on the figure on the left, has been substantially above previous trends, and that's reflected in the figure on the right, which shows the second to the top bar is this year's temperature way above that warming, historical warming trend, and next year's projected to be even hotter. And there are various factors that explain this, including some natural variability, but it's a stark reminder of the issues we're facing. Next slide, please. And the way I like to sort of simplistically conceptualize this problem is the figure on the right is the last glacial maximum, around 18,000 years ago. That was a time of global temperatures around 5 degrees cooler than they are pre-industrial, and that was a world radically transformed from the one we face today, with ice sheets covering the Isle of Man, getting down towards London, and that's a reflection of ice age cycles that occur on an order of sort of tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of years, and we have the potential to be achieving that magnitude of change in just a matter of 150 years. So I don't think we can underestimate the degree to which we're experimenting with the Earth system in a fairly potentially transformative way. Next slide, please. And so that's been reflected, thankfully, in a degree of policy response so far at a global level. And I've just screen grabbed some recent headlines that are there to illustrate that. So the top left is the International Energy Agency, that's the world's most authoritative energy body, saying that the world shift to clean energy is now unstoppable. And even if we didn't have any additional policy ambition, the figure, the infographic on the top right shows the trends that we're seeing. So renewables starting to dominate new power sources, electric cars, electric heating outside selling gas boilers and so on, and that's even if we didn't have any additional raised ambition. At the moment, the COP28 climate meeting, despite being held in a fossil fuel producing state, is urging a tripling of renewable capacity. Businesses are urging this, and this is very much the direction of travel we're seeing. Next slide, please. And just to illustrate that again with a couple more points, this is data from the IEA's World Energy Outlook 2023, which shows electric car sales rocketing, solar PV capacity additions rocketing, and interestingly, Chinese economic growth projections falling, resulting in this sort of structural shift in emissions projections. And then on the right, there's a slightly busy figure from a think tank called EMBA, which looked at the latest data on emissions trends in countries around the world, and it seems like at least half of them are already past a peak in fossil fuel power. And next slide, please. Just to sort of finally emphasise that point, the figure on the left is showing the first hints that Chinese emissions are about to enter some form of structural decline from next year onwards. They continue to produce new coal capacity, but at the same time they're deploying, frankly, hard to conceive of levels of solar and wind at the moment that hopefully will result in Chinese emissions peaking ahead of where their stated policies suggested they would. And then on the right, we see data from the US, which shows the relatively significantly greater deployment of renewables compared to fossil fuels. And I think the interesting thing about this figure is that trend continued even through a Republican administration, which was somewhat hostile to renewable deployment. That trend existed regardless. And so despite the fact that we'll undoubtedly face political headwinds in the coming years, there's a level of underlying momentum here, a structural change that's hard to avoid. Next slide, please. And these trends very much fed into the development of the economic strategy and the island plan. The figures on the left show renewable energy usage and emissions per capita on the Isle of Man, both of which are relatively poor compared to comparator nations, and that led to this commitment in those strategies to in the economic strategy to put sustainability at the heart of economic growth on the island in the future. And part of the evidence base which informed that economic strategy involved discussions and conversations with some of the world's leading corporations, some of the biggest businesses and some of the most senior people in those businesses. And the message that came across incredibly clearly from those conversations is, we will not invest in the Isle of Man unless we can access renewable power. And that's irrespective of the fact that we have a number of advantages in terms of our tax base, for example, but we're not on the list unless we start to reflect these global trends that are occurring around the world. And that's not to mention those businesses on island who we know lose out on tens of millions of pounds investment because they're not able to demonstrate the fact that they can source renewable power. And this is the second building block of our energy policy, this need to reflect this unstoppable global momentum towards low carbon in our plans and policies. Next slide, please. And the third one is the energy security, energy independence angle. And that's been very much come more to the fore for obvious reasons since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I don't want to overemphasize the risks here. I mean, we're in a much better place than we were a year or so ago. European gas storage is full, it's at good levels. A cold winter would be problematic, but nevertheless, we're in a much better place than we were a year or so ago. But there's a lot more volatility in energy markets now. We're competing with the likes of China for liquefied natural gas in a way that we weren't before. This figure on the left, bottom left, shows European natural gas prices and the way that they've been influenced by a series of just seemingly minor things, but strikes at Australian LNG terminals. The strike happens, the price goes up, negotiations happen, the price goes down a bit, and it's incredibly volatile. And if we can find some way to hedge against this volatility and to some degree mitigate the kind of problems that we've seen over the past year or so through through greater energy independence and through the provision of renewables and low carbon technologies on island, then that potentially and hopefully buffers us to a degree from future energy shocks of the kind that's been so detrimental to the island in recent months. The amount that Manx Utilities paid in gas above their normal baseline would horrify you, and if we can to some extent shield ourselves from those pressures, then that's another key aspiration of the energy policy. Next slide, please. So to sort of summarise where we are, we've got a fossil fuel dominated electricity power mix and a need to decarbonise. We've got high levels of grid stability and resilience, so we have benefits as well as challenges. We are largely import dependent. We have businesses and potential new businesses that can't meet their decarbonisation targets. And we're facing this period of significant investment requirements and change against this broader backdrop of economic pressure that we're all so well aware of. And finally, we do have a set of ambitious targets that we need to put into action. We have a decarbonisation target for 2030 that's actually incredibly ambitious, and were we to be able to achieve that, and we think there's good reason that there's a pragmatic plan to do so, that will put the Isle of Man at a competitive advantage when we think of these investment trends that I've been talking about previously. Next slide, please. So I'll talk now in the next 2-3 slides about what the energy policy actually says, and then I'll hand over to Lizzie to talk into a bit more detail about MU's implementation of this overarching vision. So the basic headline tagline we came up with was that the energy strategy's vision for the island's future is one in which our net zero ambition supports the economic strategy, takes advantage of low carbon technologies, and optimises natural resources, making us more independent and prosperous. Next slide, please. And what are our goals? Well, we want to provide support for the delivery of our island plan and the energy economic strategy, and we're very pro. It's an unashamedly pro kind of growth, pro economic vision that we're trying to put forward with the tools that we have in our energy policy armoury. We want to do our best to support the economy as much as we can. We also want to support the delivery of our net zero targets to make our contribution to those climate change problems that were so starkly illustrated in the initial slides that I presented. We want to enable the transition of energy generation to occur in an economically efficient manner, and considering the economy as a whole was my somewhat overly wordy way of trying to say we're going to look at the whole system economic impacts of what we're doing and not just focus on one individual element of that, and think of the economy as a whole, think of the costs, think of the benefits, and try and pick our way through that in a way that is most economically effective. Incredibly importantly, to ensure that the energy transition is fair and equitable and doesn't overly burden those who are most struggling to be able to cope. Similarly to, and I'll touch again on this in a little bit more detail, but to ensure that people and businesses can benefit from the net zero transition. Interrelatedly, to make greater use of our own energy resources and to increase energy independence for the reasons that I've been discussing. And finally, and I don't think we can again underestimate the importance of this, but to maintain the island's existing levels of power system resilience. Because the lights always switch on, we can become a little bit complacent about the job that major utilities have done in terms of providing secure and reliable power, and we're not prepared to do anything that compromises that. And the good news is we've got a way to do that, and we've got a way to decarbonise, meet our targets, meet all our aspirations in a way that continues to maintain energy security and resilience. Because believe me, if we didn't, Lizzie would tell me off and make that abundantly clear. Next slide, please. So what's the actual energy strategy look like? So it's at this stage, it's a fundamentally kind of framework document, one that sets out the building blocks of future energy policy and provides an overarching framework in which future policy decisions will be further developed and built upon. We're going to do further work to develop each of those principles that I'll describe in a little more detail in a second, and develop more specific policies, and we're committed to producing an annual update annually, showing our progress and also developing those themes in a bit more detail. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I've just got 2 more left. The principles and the themes of the strategy are very much reflective of the kind of issues that I've been talking about, but we will increase our energy independence and security through on-island renewables and carbon neutral energy generation for all those reasons I've discussed around the benefits of greater independence. The second one is we will optimise the level of on-island renewables and carbon neutral generation, which is a way of basically saying we're going to do our best to tease our way through the different competing pressures, benefits, trade-offs of on-island energy generation, managing the economic impacts, managing the social impacts, managing the environmental impacts, and do so in a way that's, as best we can, an optimal solution that balances all the different issues that are in play. In theory, we could do everything on island, but to do so we know would be incredibly costly and would have a significant level of impact in multiple ways. And so our job is to try and find a solution that balances things as best as we possibly can. We want to provide a supportive environment for business low carbon needs, again reflecting my point that this is an unashamedly pro-growth, pro-economy position and strategy. We'll do that in a way that balances some of the challenges that implies in terms of grid, in terms of cost, but we start from the perspective that we're here to support business and their renewable energy needs. Next slide, please. Final slide from me. We're going to work and prioritise delivery of the offshore wind farm project that you will have heard about, and we're also going to scope out the possibility, and it's just a possibility at this stage, of a future licensing round for offshore wind, because those projects can potentially bring in, frankly, transformative levels of revenue for the island economy. And we're going to do so in a way, again, that balances all the different competing uses of the seas, develop a proper marine spatial plan that allows us to manage those projects against fishing, against shipping and navigation, and so on, but we're committed to at least look at that. Fifth, we're going to, in the near term, have renewables projects that are in public ownership, because our evidence demonstrates that will deliver the lowest cost to the consumer. We will keep that under review because obviously there's a finite amount of government capital available, and we're always open to conversations with private developers, particularly if they can demonstrate that they can produce projects on the same cost or lower basis than the MU. But as it stands, our evidence suggests that the cheapest and most cost-effective way to do this is public ownership. And then finally, from me, a point around consumers and net zero transition. And this is where the strategy starts to get into a broader set of policy areas. But this is essentially reflective of our firmly held belief that the net zero transition can be genuinely good for households, it can be good for people, it can deliver comfier homes, warmer homes with lower bills, and in a way that allows people to take control of their energy usage in a manner that also supports grid decarbonisation more broadly, because you can use smart technologies to flatten out the demand curve, and that will result fundamentally in a lower cost of transition overall. And so you get this kind of virtuous circle if we can get this right. And we'll be saying more on this aspect in the coming years. In the coming year, next year, I'm writing a heat decarbonisation strategy and a replacement for the Green Living Grant scheme as well. So you'll hear more from us on how the power system aspect of it intersects with heat. So I think that's it from me. Hopefully that sets up Lizzie quite nicely on the policy side of things, and she's going to take you through how you are taking some of these aspects forward.
Thank you very much. So Steve has quite nicely covered the energy policy aspect, and I'm going to present the strategy that Manx Utilities have developed, which tie all of those policy objectives into something that can actually be delivered and also meet the government targets. So our transition programme was formed back in 2021 now in response to the ascension of the Climate Act 2021. We knew we had to act. Next slide, please. So the first slide shows our energy transition roadmap. So we're here to talk about onshore wind today, but that is one of a myriad of projects we've actually got in development to support the elements of the energy policy. The very first thing we'll start to see rolled out on the island is actually public solar projects. So up to 10 megawatts that will be installed on brownfield sites across the public estate. That's rooftops and car parks, and they're going to be installed on the largest sites we've got that have the best solar conditions in the areas of the grid which are the strongest, so we know we can deliver them. Moving forwards to 2026, we have the target to deliver 20 megawatts of onshore wind, which is why we're here today. Neither of these projects, in Manx Utilities' views, represent security of supply in our power system. So our security of supply is still being met at this point by our CCGT, the gas power station at Pulrose, our interconnector, and the diesels we have in place between Pulrose and Peel. So none of that changes at this point. Moving forwards to 2029, if we're going to phase out any of those fossil fuel assets, we know that we need something that can turn on at any point in time and deliver on-demand generation and meet exactly what we need at any point in time, regardless of the weather. And we will need to deliver that before 2030 because we have a formal target to decarbonise our power system by 2030. Also by 2030, we're planning on the delivery of a second interconnector between the Isle of Man and Great Britain. And there's
additional options for that second interconnector and ways we can combine it with other projects that are going on, which we're also pursuing as well to make sure we get the best value for the customers of the island. And if we've got all of those projects delivered, that gives us, on one hand, affordable electricity, which meet the environmental targets for having 20 megawatts of onshore renewables by 2026, but it also meets what we know we need to do, which is maintain the current level of security of supply on Ireland. So we get the transition and we also get the same reliable electricity that we're used to. Beyond that, there is so much change at the moment in technical development. So we often get questions, why you're not pursuing tidal, why you're not pursuing wave. Now, these technologies are not yet commercially viable at the scale that we need to rely on, but they could become so after 2030. So we want to keep all of the options open for the future and leave room to integrate these technologies later, further down the line. So there's a number of options we're pursuing after 2030. One would be the connection into an offshore wind farm. That's a potential option for the Isle of Man. And the reason that is a potentially good option is because if an offshore wind farm is selling all of their power primarily into another market, there is no risk to the customers of the Isle of Man if we connect into that system, because if we don't need it, they can sell it to someone else. We don't need to take on that commercial burden for them. Other options in the pipeline are combinations of storage and additional renewables and some carbon neutral baseload options, which we'll talk through later. But the world is our oyster post 2030, we're not ruling anything out. Thank you very much. So Steve sort of covered this in his policy overview, but we actually have a legal obligation under the Electricity Act to balance the power we produce in what's called the energy trilemma. And the energy trilemma represents the key balance between affordable electricity, and affordable, if we go by today's prices, really means we're not going to increase the costs or do our best to avoid increasing the costs as far as we can. It's the balance between the environment. So yes, we need to make sure that we deliver on any government targets that have been set to us, but it's going beyond that. So we have to consider things like net biodiversity gain at our sites when we deliver projects. We need to make sure that we don't, for example, increase particulate levels from emissions from carbon neutral fuels. So we may not produce carbon dioxide, but we need to make sure we don't produce other harmful pollutants that are damaging to health. And the final aspect is security of supply. So Steve's touched on why that's such a concern for us. In 1996, the Isle of Man had its last blackout, which for a nation in Europe is a fantastic achievement. And something that we don't really want to lose that track record of having a very secure power supply in all that time. In 2019, the UK had a major brownout event. So they almost lost half of the supplies in the UK following a major trip on one power station, followed by another major trip on another one, and it resulted in power cuts across the whole of the UK. In Ireland in 2019, they had nationwide blackouts as a result of not having enough firm capacity, as in that on-demand generation, to meet their demand. So the fact that we haven't had one in over 20 years is a fantastic achievement, and we have to date one of the most secure power systems in the whole of Europe. And that's attracted a lot of businesses to the island. So these businesses may now be wanting to pursue ESG objectives, but they don't want to lose that resilience that we've built on our power system. So the first phase, as I mentioned, is about delivering the first two aspects of the trilemma, so affordability and meeting the first environmental targets that we have been set. Irrespective of any project Manx Utilities are delivering, we have at this point in time around 4 megawatts of behind-the-meter installations, so private solar installations on people's houses. And by 2026, we know from what is on our own books in our network design team that there may well be an additional 10 megawatts on the grid by 2026, and we have to facilitate those connections. We have our 10 megawatt solar project to deliver as well, so that would be 20 megawatts of solar on our system. We also have set up a guaranteed green tariff to allow businesses to access imported renewable electricity through the interconnector. And the final project in that stream is the 20 megawatt onshore wind farm. We're also carrying out, though, 2 feasibility studies to support the other projects we have in the pipeline, to make sure we've done significant investigations and ensure we are still maintaining affordability in the future and considering the environmental impacts. So a quick comparison of why the big headline figure is 20 megawatts of wind rather than 20 megawatts of solar. The U-shaped graphs, or the U-shaped lines that we've got on both of these charts represent annual demand on the Isle of Man. Most of the power we use is used in the winter months. It makes sense, we use more lighting in winter, we tend to have electric heating, and our demand actually peaks at around 73 megawatts in the winter period. And in contrast, in summer, our demand can fall as low as 20 megawatts and is decreasing every year because, unlike the UK, we're not needing to invest in a lot of air conditioning and refrigeration because our climate isn't quite affecting us as much as it is in the UK. So when we're thinking about technologies, things that produce a lot of power in the middle of summer are not really helpful for decarbonising our power system or reducing our use of gas. So solar tends to typically produce most of its power between May and June, and you can see the graph on the left-hand side of the screen shows that it's really poorly fitted actually for the Isle of Man's demand. Now, on the other hand, wind it's typically windier around the month of January, and between November and February we see our highest wind speeds on the island. Wind speeds in summer are a lot lower, and subsequently, power output from a wind farm is very well aligned with the demand on the island, which means we don't have to cut it off at any point because demand is too low. That would happen with solar, but it's still part of the energy mix. So we do have some smaller scale proposed solar developments. As mentioned, we're starting in the strongest area of the network, which is Douglas. The initial projects are the NSC, Nobles Hospital and the Sea Terminal. We are discussing this and actively working with other government departments to make sure we can roll these out. If we do those initial projects, we're going to just aim for over 4 megawatts. But the reality is some of those sites actually have scope to be a lot larger, so we could get a lot more capacity and potentially limit the amount of installations we've got in the whole project. Beyond that, we'd be working with some central areas and areas down the south to also look at installing solar panels on some buildings. This is a public building down south, just as an example. And in the final stage of the project, we'd be looking to utilise buildings in the north of the island, and that gives us time to strengthen the network where we need to. So if we do all of those things, that would give us an absolute maximum peak of around 12.4 megawatts. Which, after we've completed the design work, is likely to be reduced slightly to about 10 megawatts. I'm going to skim through these quite quick.
No.
That's fine, thank you. So an initial very, very high level cost screening, we identified over 32 sites on public estate that were suitable for solar rollout. In total, we could put solar and generate 30 megawatts, but that would be obviously way too much for our current demand in summer. 5 of those sites alone were suitable for between 1 and 2 megawatts of solar. So there really are large, massive locations. The largest solar site on the island to date is just 250 kilowatts or thereabout. So these would be the biggest renewable installations to date once we've started delivery. The remaining 21 sites are just under 0.5 megawatts, so again, double the size of the largest installations we've got on island. 3 of the sites on the initial screening were suitable for onshore wind. Ian's going to go into much more detail about that in his presentation when he goes through, because there's an additional audit and site selection we've done after this process. And the total wind capacity from that initial high-level overview was 30 megawatts.
Yeah, just one more. So initially, these 3 sites, we've shared this before. We identified Sulby and Druridale in the north of the island, Injibrak and Baldwin in the middle of the island, and Eristane and Skird in the south of the island. Injibrak and Baldwin looks ideal, and in fact every desktop exercise you ever did for that site looks fantastic. And once you dip into the feasibility studies, what you'll notice about that site is it's very restricted in terms of access. So, as an example of why that was very quickly ruled out, we know that we would need to remove at least 1 church from that transport route, which is unacceptable, and build a large amount of roads and widen a large amount of road to access that track. And even if we did that, it's still limited to around 3 megawatts, so not suitable for a 20 megawatt onshore wind farm. Thank you. So the first site, Sulby, there's limitations on what we can get to that site in terms of turbine size. So to deliver 20 megawatts at that site, we would need between 7 and 12 turbines. The more turbines you have at a site, the higher the environmental impact. In addition, we would also need to change around 4 kilometres of road to access that site or deliver turbines to that site. But irrespective of that, it's still got a really good potential for generating power. So we would potentially see up to 81 gigawatt hours produced from that site, depending on the design, maybe a bit more. And it would save around just under a third of the current gas use that we've got today. So a big opportunity for decarbonisation. Eristane, on the other hand, and it is Eristane, the plantation that we would be developing, not necessarily the Skird site, would instead only need between 4 and 5 turbines to generate the 20 megawatts. In fact, in some design options, we might be able to go as low as 3 turbines at that site, but we're still in the middle of completing feasibility studies. And from 4 to 5 turbines, we could generate up to 100 to 130 gigawatt hours. So a massive increase relative to Sulby, and that's because the wind speeds are much higher at that site than they are at Sulby. And Ian and Paul will again talk to you about why that is important. So that is the preferred site. We're currently carrying out the environmental impact assessment, and I've just got some images to share with you next. Please. Yeah. That's brilliant. Thank you. So the first is the one that has been most frequently shared with the media on the island, which is the view closest to the site. So it's around 2 kilometres away from the site. The second is the view from Castletown. The one at the top is just taken from the top of the slot. It is the closest image we have to the wind farm or proposed wind farm location to date. And the image at the bottom is the view from Port St Mary. So phase 2, as I mentioned, is all about delivering security of supply. So the big things around security of supply is the delivery of the second interconnector and the delivery of dispatchable generators. So not necessarily things that we would use all the time. We may not ever import electricity from the UK, but the connection of an interconnector itself provides the level of firm capacity we currently enjoy today. So it can always be relied on providing it's in service. Also in that phase of work, we'd be carrying out the feasibility work to support economic developments later in the process. So that's all aspects of the trilemma now met, providing we deliver these things. And again, and again. Thank you. So before we showed you the difference between annual demand versus solar and wind, these are now the daily demand profiles. So profiles over 24 hours between the 21st of June, which is the green line at the bottom, and the 21st of December, which is the blue line at the top. And I did mention the minimum demand and maximum demand, which is roughly around 20 megawatts, absolute minimum in summer, to absolute maximum between 5 and 7 every day, 73 megawatts typically in winter. Now, we have to be able to generate enough power at each of these times to meet that demand. We can't have too much power or we end up
causing problems on the power system, starting to lead to equipment failing, and in your homes, that's causing major equipment damage to things like TVs and appliances. And not enough is the lights going out. So that's what we constantly have to balance on island as operators of the power system. And that means having a source that you can control or always guarantee it every time. Because not meeting those criteria means we've got problems either way. So when we're looking at potential technologies that we could utilise to deliver that guaranteed power, there's really only 3 shows in town. If we start with the renewables first, the typical load factors of solar, or capacity factor, sorry, is 11%. So what that means is if you install 100 megawatts of solar, on average, on the Isle of Man, it'll only ever output 11 megawatts. So that's not great in terms of what we need. If we move that up to a typical tidal facility, which is another option, we can predict tides, but they're not regular, they're not constant. So typically they will only generate power on a rising tide or a falling tide, not the ebb and not the peak. And actually the capacity factor of that tide, while we think they're always there, is only 28%. So likewise, 100 megawatts will typically deliver 28 megawatts. Moving up to a typical onshore wind farm, and ours is slightly looking a bit better than this, more reliable, will typically have a capacity factor of 35%. So again, 100 megawatts will produce 35 megawatts. Offshore wind can potentially be relied on a bit more. And when you take offshore wind up to the scale of a massive development in the Irish Sea, so something of 1 gigawatt in size, that development, if we were plugged into it, would have a relative capacity factor for the Isle of Man of around 90%. So it could be relied on a lot more. So it could play a role in security of supply if it's paired up with some sort of cable that connects us to another jurisdiction. But the 3 technologies that we can rely on are interconnectors. So our existing interconnector has typically tripped unexpectedly once in a 10-year period. That's the average rate of trip on that cable. That compares to the gas power station of around 2 to 3 trips a year. So a lot less reliable than the interconnector, but at least we can turn it on and off when we want to. Diesels that we have at Peel and Pulrose are even less reliable than that, but still very, very good, over 80%. So whatever technology we have in the future, if we want to keep the same level of security of supply on island, we'll definitely need one of those 3 options. So first option is the second interconnector. That's the best thing in terms of security of supply that we could have on the island. And again, thank you. And the other 2 is a choice between gas turbines, which would have potentially higher cost but higher availability, or a diesel, which might have lower cost but it's less available. And we're doing some feasibility work at this point in time to determine where the preference for technology sits. We do need a carbon neutral fuel to run in these technologies though, so something like hydrogen or a biofuel, and at this point in time, if we had to pick either of those options, biofuel is probably the most credible at this point in time, but we've only got a limited ability to produce a lot of fuel on the island at this point in time. If we want to go a lot bigger, we would have to roll into something like kelp conversion into biofuel, and that's not a technology that's currently viable. And finally, we do get asked questions about storage. That is how each of those 2 technologies compares to storage. The big box is the availability of an interconnector. It is essentially a massive battery, but it's available 352 days a year. And that's because we're essentially plugged into an infinite power system in the UK. The next bar, which is the dark green bar on the right-hand side, represents what the current storage ability of our existing diesels is. So at Pulrose and at Peel, we have 12 days worth of fuel stock in those diesels. So if we ever lost the gas interconnector or the existing interconnector, we can still keep the lights on for 12 days without having to default and import more fuel. But the very small squares that you probably can't make out from where you're sitting is where battery storage currently sits and pumped hydro currently sits. So biggest pumped hydro in the UK is De Norwig, much, much higher than the Isle of Man's geography. That lasts 6 hours in the UK. And the biggest battery storage in the UK is a facility called Pillswood, 191 megawatt hours, which would last just under 3 hours if it was supplying the whole of the Isle of Man. And that's where the technology is. Now, it's going to improve further down the line, but at the moment, we have to back the horses that we know are going to win, which is the interconnector and some sort of dispatchable generator so we can store the fuel. Okay, and the last one I'm just going to quickly touch on is economic opportunities, which leads into Steve's final point about economic growth on the island. There's a variety of options that we're currently considering. One is a connection into an offshore wind farm, and the others are a variety of possible options that we've been exploring following feasibility work. So next slide, I'm just going to show you what those are. So we did a study that was done last year that looked at what opportunities there were if we were trying to sell electricity into the UK market. And these have very, very long lead times, so we're not able to deliver these before 2030. In some cases, they're not viable for certain reasons, but they might be overcome, or those reasons might be overcome in the next few years. So the first is biofuel. So we can't grow enough fuel to do this yet. We might in the future if we start to use the marine space to use kelp, but that would take some time. That's one possible option. The next is utilising gas power, but with carbon capture and underground storage. So on the island, it doesn't appear that at this point in time carbon capture and underground storage is viable, but it could be later down the line. The third is hydrogen. So hydrogen storage is not commercially viable and it's very difficult to store at the moment. But it again could be an option in the future, especially if our gas pipeline starts to have blends of hydrogen in it. The lowest cost option, and the cost that would seem to have really good economic value for export, is a small modular reactor. So if you think the challenges of trying to build a wind farm are hard, that would be slightly more challenging to try and install a nuclear reactor on the island. Storage-wise, liquid air energy storage actually seems to be one of the most viable options for the island, and that would involve the conversion of a gas turbine, for example, to instead compress air rather than exporting gas into the grid. So it's a potential option where we could retrofit pull rows and utilise the existing assets we've got and maintain employment levels where they are today. Future is completely open for these technologies, but these are just some ideas that have come out of the studies that have been done to date. Okay, and to summarise, we have developed what we're calling the Future Energy Triskelion. So that's how we balance these areas. The very first area of the Triskelion represents meeting the energy trilemmas. The very first slide I started with, that balance between affordability, security of supply and the environment, will be met by everything we've got in the pipeline up to 2030. If you want to go beyond that and start to look for independence, we can't do that with our projects because it is reliant on a second interconnector. But a second interconnector does potentially allow you to connect into an offshore wind farm. And we think that is probably the most viable way of becoming 100% independent or very close to it in terms of energy production. And the final aspect is about securing economic opportunities. So developing any of those technologies we've just mentioned, developing additional renewables and bringing them onto the system with storage, we can do that as long as there is a route to market. So we don't have a large enough energy market on the island today, but we could sell power into other markets, into the UK and into Europe. That will require additional interconnectors, but we'll absolutely work with the private sector if they want to do that. Thank you. So I'm now going to hand over to Ian and Paul, who will cover their site selection process for the onshore wind farm.
Thank you very much, Lizzie. Much appreciated. So my name's Ian Ramsbottom. I work for Wardle Armstrong and I'm the director in charge of the EIA process. One thing that would be good for you guys to understand is that Wardle Armstrong do this as a regular work stream, we've undertaken EIAs across the world for energy renewables, in particular wind farms. And you'll be hearing from Paul, one of our leads for the renewables sector, who will give you some additional information. I should say as well, thank you very much to all of you who were able to come and see us today. It was very good, and thank you for all for coming this afternoon. We're committed to holding more of the drop-in sessions so that you can ask regular questions and we can give you regular updates on how the EIA process is going, and so that you can challenge different aspects about along the way. Your input is very much required and requested for that EIA process. We want to be as thorough and robust as possible. So as Tim has already mentioned, statutory consultees ideally keep their opinions to after the scoping stage. That feeds into, we do want your input at this stage, but the opinions come afterwards. And it's already been touched on, so we'll skip to the next slide about the... So the reason we're here today is to talk to you. As part of the EIA process, we wanted to undertake an independent audit of the site selection that was already previously undertaken. So we do one on our own, independently as a consultancy, looking at hard constraints on island. And that doesn't just consider government-owned sites, which I know was a concern that was raised earlier today to us. It considers every single piece of the island. And we'll go through that with you. And the key point here is that we have to do that to make sure that the planning process and the EIA process is robust and challengeable, so that we haven't missed something. If this process had raised something that said a different site was more suitable, that is something we will be sharing with you. What I am going to do for a little while is hand over to Paul to take you through the next slide, and then I'll join you.
Thank you. So this is a process that we have carried out for numerous clients all over the country, all over the world really, and something we've been doing for sort of 20 years plus for various people. It's also a process that we teach to renewable energy students at the University of Exeter, so it's something that we're sort of well experienced doing and have carried out sort of regularly, and is an iterative process that's got better and better over time. First thing that we tend to look for is wind speed. Obviously there's very little point developing a wind farm in an area where there is no wind. In this case we've used 8 metres a second as a cut-off to filter sites. That's not to say that everything over 8 metres a second will be a fantastic site, but as a fast filter to make sure that we're sort of eliminating the worst sites and only focusing on the best ones. 8 metres a second worked for the Isle of Man. Other parts of the world, we've done projects in Germany where that cut-off will be much lower, it will be more like 5, and that's dependent on the resource of where you're working. So in this case, we went to 8 metres a second. Next slide. This slide is just a little bit of an example that shows you the difference in the energy output from a wind turbine at different wind speeds. So as you can see on the graph, just as an example, going between 7 and 8 metres a second, so a 1 metre a second increase in wind speed, that gives you a 24% increase in energy output. So dramatic differences here. It's not just a case of dropping from 10 metres a second to 9 metres a second. That's not going to make much of a difference. It actually makes an enormous difference to the amount of energy that you're going to generate. Next slide, please. The next thing we would then filter by is environmental designations. Now this is not every environmentally sensitive piece of land on the island. This is areas that are designated and protected for specific reasons. And obviously we want to avoid those areas. Work has been done in the past to select those areas, to designate them, so we want to exclude them from the process. That includes bird sanctuaries, nature reserves, Ramsar sites, such special scientific interests, heathland, basically everything on island that has a designation applied to it. So once we've got those removed, we end up with the map that you can see on the screen. Effectively, the areas in blue that don't have a red piece attached to them are the areas that are left to us at this point, and then we keep adding constraints to filter down a little bit further. So this is a really interesting one, is the noise buffers. So what we've done here is effectively drawn a circle around every property on the island. We've used 500 metres as an indicative distance for noise. That's not a fixed distance, and I want to be absolutely clear, this is just an indicative distance based on experience elsewhere that we use as a guide to see where there's gaps between properties. Noise limits for wind farms are actually dictated by a combination of background noise at various different wind speeds and then the turbine noise generation itself, and it's quite a complex area in its own right, and you can't do that for every site, so this is a proxy for noise impacts. But what it does do, as you can see, is very quickly narrow down the available areas. The other one, sort of, potentially there was fewer sites around here, but one thing that we had to take into account was a 5-kilometre buffer around the airport. That was dictated to us by the airport in terms of protection for safeguarding, protecting aircraft. Obviously, we don't want any safety impacts, people flying in and out of the island. However, that doesn't mean there won't be further studies as we go down the road looking at impacts on radar, safeguarding. There's a whole suite of studies that will need to be carried out in order to ensure that there are no impacts on the airport going forward. But this is a sort of, again, an initial cull just to make sure that we're filtering to the best sites. Finally, there was also a roads buffer. So effectively we took, again, every road on the island and we used a 165-metre buffer from the roads, and that's effectively, again, a safety buffer. So in the unlikely event that anything happened with the turbines, it would mean that the turbines wouldn't fall onto roads, or there wouldn't be components from the turbines falling onto roads. It's a fairly standard thing to do, sort of nationally, internationally, to apply that sort of TOPL plus 10% buffer. The reality is it's never used. It's extremely unusual for these things to fail, but that's standard practice in terms of design. The other one we've looked at, which is quite a big one here actually, possibly compared to other places, the island is hilly, and those hills are very steep. And it's quite important in terms of accessing sites as well as the sites themselves. They cannot be too steep. You can't get the components up steep hills. And in terms of actually installing foundations on a steep slope, you'd have to cut a lot of material away. The environmental impact of that would be high, so we've avoided extremely steep sites as well as part of this. Thank you. And then that leaves us with these remaining sites. Theoretically, all of the sites that you can see there in blue are developable based on the constraints that I've just gone through a minute ago. So what we then do is take those sites and then look at them in a bit more detail individually. This is effectively as far as you can go using sort of publicly available constraints data effectively. So then once you're at this point, it's a case of going through a little bit further, looking at each site individually, seeing what the issues are, and then ranking them against each other, so that you can work out which one's best to take forward. So I'll just pass back to Ian again to take you through that process.
Thanks, Paul. Much appreciated. Yeah, so the first thing we did of the 15 sites that we identified was a signable letter, so that we could try and look at these objectively. We don't want influence from our side or any sides or constraints from that side. So there are the sites listed. So the next considerations that Paul has talked about, that we looked at, the first one was transport. Can we get the components for these wind farms up to these sites? We've already talked about the contours of an island, but what Paul and we haven't mentioned yet is the actual difficulty of some of the road network. We have very twisty roads, which are excellent for racetracks, but not so good for transporting components. So that's one aspect we looked at. The next one was mining of minerals. Now, we are also the minerals agent for the island, so that's helpful. We can look at that in good detail. And here we were looking at constraints that might stop that. You have a very rich mining heritage on island that can cause problems for development and can indeed stop some development or make it unaffordable. The next one was archaeology and heritage. Again, you have an incredible archaeology and heritage resource on island. It's very, very compact. It's not like many other areas of the UK at all. And it's about protecting that as well. That has to be considered. And the next one was peat soils. You can develop in peat soils for wind farms, and we do in Scotland and other areas, but where it becomes too deep, that becomes a problem, and I'll get onto that shortly. So, the first thing is, can we get the components to the sites? So the blue crosses on the sites that you can see, are sites that we consider you would have to undertake significant alterations, modifications to the transport network to be able to get components to these sites. So what we consider significant, just to give you an example, the one that's just north of Douglas there, we would have to essentially expand the prom, which I don't think would be popular. The site towards the north, you might be able to read is site Q. We would have to make amendments to the TT track, in particular the pedestrian bridge just south of the bungalow. Again, it is a racetrack, and that would have to be done and undertaken, and the construction period is in May to August. I think we could all agree that a risk to the TT would not be sensible. So all of the sites are the same. The Blue Cross, we've undertaken basic swept path analysis for, to see if these components can be delivered to those sites. All of them could be looked at further, but we have to do an initial sieve to consider them within reason. So the next one is I said about mining and minerals. So the yellow cross, and apologies, we're running out of colours for those of you who are colourblind. Those all have potential mining issues at those sites. Now that could be something as simple as mine shafts, or you could have significant problems related to mining and minerals, including mineral safeguarding zones. So those sites were then counted out at this stage. So then, as I mentioned before, we looked at the peat maps across the island. You can build wind farms on peat. It is about the carbon balance and the offset. If you release too much carbon from the peat, you essentially render the point of the wind farms gone away, because all of a sudden you're releasing the carbon that you're trying to save from being released in fossil fuels. So we have mapped the peat across the island, and that has knocked out several of the sites, or several large portions of other sites. It's not just about knocking them out entirely, you've got to get up to these sites. So where some of the sites are surrounded by peat, excuse me, but the site isn't itself, you would still have to have potentially an access track that would need to be dug through peat, or something similar, which does pose a problem. So yeah, the next one was archaeology and heritage. We've looked at all of those and talked to the heritage people on Ireland as well. Heritage is a little bit of a tricky one, because some heritage assets are potentially higher value than others, but that is again a little bit subjective. So what we decided to do is look, if you look at the green square, there are certain sites which do not have any heritage assets within the boundary, or within reasonable influencing distance. So that was a screen for that as well that we applied. So that left us with these three sites that are on the screen. So you have, next slide please. So you have Slewmannock at the top, which is the plantation. We have the Round Table, which is the little town in the south, and Eristane itself, which is site out. So, site Q and K are potentially suitable to develop a 20 megawatt wind farm. But they do both face challenges that Eristane does not, so that is the heritage assets limits. Q in particular would be the site where we would struggle with the pedestrian bridge at the bungalow for the racetrack as well, so that causes problems. And I suppose critically, you can have a look at, we've supplied the wind speeds there, the data, which Eristane is significantly higher, 0.9 higher than the other sites. If you remember Paul's slide from earlier, you understand how significant that is. Paul said earlier that I think we used an example that was 6 to 7 metres per second. The difference here represents somewhere between 18 and 20% difference of increase. So it's not quite as much as what was on Paul's slide for the low wind speeds, but it's still incredibly significant. That wind speed change and the energy generated will be determined by the actual turbines that are chosen, so it could again become even more significant if you go for larger turbines, for example. So, where that left us in our independent assessment is that Eristane is the preferred site for these reasons. There are multiple potentially deliverable sites on your island. There are 15 that we've come up with, given the constraints, the hard constraints that we've considered. You could consider other constraints as well, and there are some more subjective aspects like LVIA, which could also be considered and weighted. But these are ones that are hard constraints that we know are there. So now the process is that we undertake our EIA. As we've already been telling, we are at the start of that process. It is a very robust and long process, and we need input from stakeholders and from statutory consultees to make sure that is as robust as possible, so that we can consider all the impacts that could occur if the Airey State site is to be developed for a wind farm. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay.
Back to Richard.
Thank you very much. Everybody finished speaking from the panel now? You've done it? There you go. Okay, ready to open to the floor? Okay. Questions, please. Lady in the middle there.
Just wait for the microphone, please.
You mentioned the access for the Selby site and the Baldwin site being unsuitable. You didn't really speak in any great detail about the access to Eriestrain, because I mean you're bringing these components which are gigantic, which we all know, probably the biggest things that have ever been brought onto the island before. Now, we understand that they're coming through Castletown. Please, can somebody explain in greater detail how you do plan to bring them to the site, if it's the chosen one, and why that means it doesn't have any problems? Thank you.
Hello, I'm Adrian. Thank you for the question. So part of the process that Wardell Armstrong have been doing for us is to do what they call a superload assessment. So bringing the components you just described onto the island is a significant thing to consider. So for the Eriestrain site, we think that there are two viable solutions. One is to bring components through the Port of Douglas and down to Castletown, along the coast and back up the Slock to the site. The alternative would be to bring the barge to Castletown, sort of parallel to the shore, take the components off onto a low-loader vehicle, and then out through the airport, and then back around through the same route along the south of the island up to Eriestrain.
Oh, you can go to that lady there, please.
Just following on from your answer to the last question, what changes do you think will need to be made to the roads on the routes that you've described? Because as has already been alluded to, there are some pretty bendy roads and also roads which probably wouldn't be able to take the weight of very large components as these would be.
Yeah, that's a very fair comment. I think the whole point of us going through this process is to properly establish a route and what the impacts of bringing these components ashore would be. My understanding of the mechanism and the delivery mechanism is you put these things onto almost like a spread load type vehicle. So you've not got point loads on the roads, and so the loads are spread fairly evenly. And so things that the assessment we've done so far as I understand it, suggests that there's very little that we would have to change. And the reason for that is because of the types of vehicles. You can actually move around corners in a fairly novel way. So for sake of argument, if you can see me there, you could normally transport a component when it's horizontal, but then as you come to a tight corner, you can raise it up like this and then turn around the corner. So those are the sorts of things, and the wind industry has been going for a very long time, and these things have been sold in other locations. So the reason we employ people like Wardell Armstrong is to explain to us and teach us how these things might be delivered.
Thank you, Adrian. The two questions there about getting these components through the roads. Will these be done in quieter times or at night, or What's the plan?
Well, our understanding at the moment is these will be fairly slow-moving things when we do move them, if we move them, and it would be most sensible to do the movement at night, so least disruption to people in their daily lives.
I think the Wardle-Armstrong report does suggest that some changes will be needed to the roads. Could you just describe in a bit more detail what those might be?
I'll just ask Ian to come and answer that question here. Thank you, Ian. So originally we've undertaken a swept path analysis of certain types of turbine. You can only do your analysis on one type of turbine at a time to see what is needed. The routes that we were talking about, that Adrian has said, so the route from Castletown, which would be the beach landing, and the route from Douglas. Obviously, Douglas is the preferred choice, I think, for most people, because it avoids beach landing. In terms of adjustments to the roads, what we're talking about is potential things like street furniture. So where you have potential road signs and things like that, our report points out that those surveys need to be done. So we have already started that. You may have been aware from the MUA website that we have had drones in the air over the last few weeks undertaking topographical surveys from the sky so that we can, in incredible detail, map these potential routes to assess the suitability of the areas that we want to transport through, and so that we can identify anything that may need to be changed. At the moment, both of those routes wouldn't require what we consider to be significant changes to the roads. So it wouldn't need regrading, we understand, but there is a lot of work to be done before we can confirm any of that. There was a question, a quick comment about the weights, and Adrian is absolutely right that the multi-axle loads spread. But our upcoming work will feed into all of this, and we will then be able to, hopefully at a later date, answer more thoroughly as to whether any road improvements would need to be made. But at the moment, our provisional surveys indicate probably not. Hopefully that answers it.
And can I just ask, I'm sorry, but there's a number of aspects to this, how you propose to get the components from the Slough to the site itself?
So, again, because there hasn't been a turbine chosen, that has not been confirmed at all.
But I think whatever kind of turbine is going to,
yes.
you're going to need some kind of road.
You're correct, yes. So there will need to be some form of access track constructed. And that would be for the duration of the turbine's lifespan, so that any maintenance can be done and decommissioning can take place. At the moment, there is potential routes that we're looking at which would go north of the site and then back. But it takes a lot of work for us to understand whether that ground is even suitable to do that.
So, excuse me, ladies.
So, just, yeah. Okay. Next, the lady got a question then? That gentleman over there next as well.
How much is this going to cost? And who's going to be paying for it? Is it the Manx Utilities or the government?
Yes, so we're still working on the full business case and the cost, and the whole purpose of the EIA. There will be some mitigations and some issues that will arise. That's the whole purpose in trying to close down on the cost. At the moment, it looks around, to be confirmed, but around 30 million will be the cost. If you look at the what it will produce in terms of energy and the cost of that energy, then the recovery of that cost and the payback should be quite a strong feature of this particular project. So as we move forward, we have to replace some plants anyway. This is going to make quite a big contribution to the island plan and renewable needs of the island, the sustainable needs of the island.
Have you looked at geothermal?
Yes, we have indeed, and there are some costs that have just come out from the UK, so they do like a contracts for difference process, and there are actually 3 projects in the UK that have been approved to develop. They're quite expensive. I can't remember the cost exactly, probably about 120 pounds per megawatt hour, something like that. So maybe double more than this wind project. Early development. From my understanding, we have a geologist here actually, but from my understanding, we've been told that the geography and the geology of the Isle of Man is not really that suitable to extract heat for power production purposes.
Okay. Gentleman in the corner there. Yes.
Yeah, this one also goes into costs and logistics as well. Has heavy helicopters been considered? You have a barge anchored in the bay and a helicopter straight to the site. You could get time down, you could get impact down.
Well, it's Adrian again. I'll answer that question, and if I get it slightly wrong, Ian will tell me off. But my understanding of heavy loads and moving these types of components with helicopters is it's actually quite dangerous. If you think about a wind turbine blade, it is effectively a sail. And so you string it underneath the helicopter, you make the helicopter very, very unstable. So it's not something that is regularly done, but Paul's going to give you some more detail.
That's right, yeah. The weights we're talking about are in excess of what a heavy lift helicopter would be capable of lifting. It's something we've looked at numerous sites all around the UK, simply because access is always a concern. At most sites there are always slight issues with access, so helicopters always comes up. But a Chinook can lift between 10 to 20 tonnes depending on the load it's lifting. They're effectively designed to lift a single tank, which is lighter, considerably lighter than the single component we're talking here. At the moment we think the heaviest single component would be about 90 tonnes. We're looking at here, so a helicopter simply wouldn't be able to lift it. There are other technologies that are being worked on. Airships is an interesting one. There's a company over on the east coast of England which has developed an airship capable of lifting 60 tonnes, and they've got a prototype then capable of lifting 150 tonnes. But at this point we just cannot guarantee that that would be available, so we can't move forward assuming that something like that would be available. Of course, if it does become available, fantastic, and we can consider using it.
Kerry.
Sorry.
Good evening. I don't know the gentleman sat next to Adrian, but we were talking about cost earlier. In the Bird and Bird report from January 23, they stated that there would be a 35 to 45% capacity factor. In your decision document, you quoted 74% capacity factor, and this evening in Lizzie's slide she's quoted a 35% capacity factor. Now 5 turbines of 21 megawatt using your original calculation was what you produced was 130 gigawatts, and that's the figure that you gave at the government conference. And that's the figure that was given to Treasury for on the decision-making document. But tonight, if you're using a 35% capacity factor, that's only going to give you 64 gigawatts. The significance of that, of course, is that the cost per kilowatt hour massively increases. So that's the first point which I'd like to make. The second point is that there seems to be a policy of the MUA being a net exporter to the UK. So in 22-23, you exported 193 gigawatts, which added to our emissions. If this is about getting our emissions down by 2026, why are you a net exporter? And just for the audience to understand, that 193 gigawatts used fossil fuels. There was 13,740,388 gas therms and over 101,000 litres of diesel. So we're getting rather mixed messages here as to, do you want to get to net zero, or are you doing this as a money-making exercise?
Yep.
Sure. If I can start off, so yeah, I'm actually the Chief Executive of Manx Utilities. So if I can take your second question first, was about the current operating regime. So Manx Utilities' primary duty in the Electricity Act is to provide efficient and economic power to the residents of the Isle of Man, its businesses, its public sector, its third sector, everybody really, in the best possible way, securely. Now, a really, really important takeaway from tonight that I just want everybody to remember is, Lizzie did raise it, for the last 25 years, there has not been a blackout here. It has attracted an enormous amount of economic output. We've got data centers. Yeah. So, the economic side and the primary duty towards minimising the cost is whatever mix that we have available to us to minimise that cost for the Isle of Man residents. That's what we do. So that optimisation process at the moment involves exporting power to the UK. As we move towards net zero, we will need to ramp that down. And in the next 6 years, we will be at net zero. So the process where we stand at the moment, we have an inventory, we don't have a carbon budget yet, and we don't have a profile down to that net zero. But that's what we will be doing in the next 6 years. We're producing that as part of the energy strategy, I think. There will be carbon targets. So that's the answer to the export equation. It optimises and minimises the cost to the Manx consumer. Sorry, could I just, your first question just remind me? Oh, capacity factors. So yes, understand the confusion. So on the slide, Lizzie's slide, there was a 35%, I think that was a UK average. One of the processes... Sorry, because those comparators are available on a UK database, and that's where we take that information from. What we have to do as part of this project is measure the precise speeds, then we can measure the precise yields, then we can measure the concise economics, and that's the process we're going through as part of the EIA.
Okay, if you don't mind, I'll just take the hand up. I'll just go to you. Great, okay. Gentlemen.
Hello, yes, you mentioned wind speeds. Has there been a monitor where the wind farm is? I believe the data you're using is taken from Ronaldsway, which is at 0, and the other site is the Round Table and somewhere else, which is 2 miles away, which is the other side of the hill. Has there been a wind anemometer which actually measures the wind speed? That's the first question. The second question is, how do you propose to take the power away from the wind farms and connect it to the network?
Who's the answer?
I'll answer it quickly, but Adrian will probably add something. So yes, the initial wind speeds were taken from national data that's freely available, and it's a rough screening exercise. It takes us to the precise location and helps us select the site. To produce the kind of quality of data that we need for precise economics, we need to do exactly as you say, really accurate and provide really accurate data on the precise location. And there is a device now to measure that. It's called the SODAR device.
I believe that's removed. It's only been there 4 months.
No, the SODAR device is still there. So to answer the second part of your question, it's important if we're going to take power away, if we can take power away from the site, if it eventually gets developed, that we try and access what we call our transmission system. It's the 33 kV or kilovolt system around the Isle of Man. Most likely connection point for us would be around about Stony Mountain, so going out across Detherland towards Stony Mountain.
Will that be pylon or underground?
Underground.
Okay. Thank you. The gentleman at the far side.
When
when you've talked about the price of electricity, you've talked, I've heard affordability mentioned, I don't know how many times. Can you define affordability?
Okay. Yes. So going back to Lizzie's trilemma, we've got to find the optimum pathway here to get the right balance between security of supply. So we need quite a lot of plans to keep the lights on. We need it to be affordable, as you say, and we need it to be clean. We need it to be sustainable. So the affordability aspect, there's two ways of looking at this. So if Manx Utilities were to finance it, can we do that from our balance sheet? Can we do that from our accounts? And the answer to that is yes, we can. The other affordability is to minimise the cost to the consumer, and that's what we are constantly striving to do, and we have done. And if you benchmark that price to the UK, if you look at the Ofgem price cap, if you look at when we were in the real crisis, the price guarantee, we were benchmarked below that. So that's not bad for a small island punching above its weight. So those are the sort of cost benchmarks we look at, but we do need to invest and make sure that the infrastructure is in place to provide that security of supply. It's really important to the island. It has been, and it's attracted a lot of business, especially places with businesses like data centres that are really, really secure supplies. So that's how I would define the cost. I'm not sure if that probably answers your question, but we will benchmark it, and we do benchmark it. In fact, very open and transparent, if you look on our website, we do an annual pricing review, we do those comparisons, and we make sure that we are in good shape versus adjacent jurisdictions.
Can you guarantee that nobody will be cut off, as has happened with gas customs recently?
We hardly cut off anybody, even during the crisis. What tends to happen, we're a really strict procedure, and as the chief executive, I have the final sign on it. It has to come to me. I will not sign it unless I've seen a massive amount of effort working with our customers, and there are many mechanisms and approaches we take to work really hard with the customers. When we do cut off supplies, it tends to be we can't track people down. They've left the island. We have done numerous attempts. There's no other option. Nobody will talk to us. If you talk to us, if you contact us, we've got an amazing track record of working well with customers, even during the most severe of crises.
So if the prices do go up instead of coming down, you can guarantee...
What I can guarantee is that on a case-by-case basis, please make the call. Our customer service departments are excellent, and they work with every customer. We're in regular touch with them. Any bad news, we get to hear about very quickly. It would be escalated and that sort of thing if there was an issue there. In fact, I think it was referenced at our last board meeting. So,
okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. The question over here, John? Yes, thank you. Just wait for the microphone, please. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. There is one form of energy which has not been mentioned. It is clean, it is green, it's here underneath the island. You don't have to go down too deep to find it. It's called geothermal. And would somebody please tell me why this has never been mentioned for the island? Thank you.
Haven't we just touched on that before? Kind of. Just simply one. Okay.
Hello, thank you. So one of the things I've been working on throughout my career are geothermal projects in Cornwall. So I've been involved with the three projects mentioned. I've been involved with recently got the CFD down in Cornwall, and I've been working since 2009 on deep geothermal projects. So I've got a reasonably good background on what makes them tick, what makes them work. One of the advantages that places like Cornwall have is history of investment in research into geothermal projects. So there was a project in the 1980s, which was government funded, which effectively looked at, they drilled a deep hole, 4 kilometres, not something you can do easily, at a cost of around, I think at that point that was around £12 million in 1980s prices, so that's a big investment. And what was learned from that was then taken forward to the project that I picked up at United Downs in 2009. And then that's taken another, where are we now? So, you know, we're talking another 14 years to bring that project to the point where we've drilled another 2 wells down to 6 kilometres depth. And hopefully there will be a power station developed on that site in the next year or so. Geothermal takes a very long time to develop. It's not something that's going to happen on island in the sorts of timeframes we're talking about to 2030. If there is a resource there, and that's it's unknown, you'd have to do a long and very expensive period of trial drilling to try and work out what's down there. You need to effectively intersect a fault, an existing fault, at a depth of 4, 5, 6, 7 kilometres. In fact, you would definitely be deeper than Cornwall here, because it is a fact that the Cornwall has the best geothermal resource in the UK. So 4, 5, 6, 7 kilometres depth, hit a fault line, and then be able to extract energy from that, you know, and you probably get a 2 to 3 megawatt project out of that after maybe 30, 40 million pounds investment. So, I mean, it may be something in the future that comes down in cost that can be developed, but it would be looking at 2040, 2050, those sorts of timescales.
Okay, thank you. The gentleman in the green over here.
I'm terribly sorry, but this is just basically not the case anymore. There is a geothermal project now off the northeast coast of the UK. It is a sealed system. They drill a single well nowadays, and they circulate water through the well, and it comes back up as steam and drives a generator on the surface. So I'm very sorry that these geothermal developments are progressing very fast, and they work. Thank you.
Thank you. Gentlemen.
Yeah, I mean, if I could just respond to that quickly. I mean, like I say, I'm probably the most experienced person in the UK currently in terms of environmental assessment and developing geothermal wells. It is something I know a lot about. And the only project that will generate electricity will be the United Downs project in Cornwall, and that is not yet developed and it's not proven. There is no other electricity generating geothermal energy project anywhere in the UK. And where those projects will and do work... Sorry. Okay.
Excuse me, just put that, please.
And like I say, it's coming and it will be developed, but it's a very expensive technology, and it's not a case, you can't just drill a hole and expect to generate electricity. There's a lot of research needs to be going on.
Okay, gentlemen, I agree. You next.
My name's Ken Watterson. If, as you suggest, the back of the meter supply is significant on the island, could I suggest that the MUA have actually inhibited its development by paying so little for domestic production?
Okay, so at the moment we have a tariff called the Sustainable Generation Tariff, which most of those types of customers that wish to generate their own electricity are on, whether that's commercial or domestic. We have a feed-in tariff, I think you're referring to the bit that's fed onto the grid. Okay, so I'll come back to that in a second. At the moment, we think there's 4 or 5 megawatts of behind-the-meter power, which we will pay that feed-in tariff to. It's primarily designed to supply their own electricity. Now, at the current growth rate, which uses a lot of local companies, local businesses, employing lots of people to do it, we think in the next 4 or 5 years that will grow to about 10 megawatts. So there is a demand there. Most of the benefit is supplying your own electricity, not feeding onto the grid. One of the issues is, exactly as you say, it's really difficult to know what price to pitch that at. Now, the price, sorry.
You're actually hindering the development, because when I put mine in, and I've got air source, I've got solar panels as well, my payback period is 18 to 20 years. Now, you're currently paying something like 9p per unit when I put energy into the grid, and you're selling it for 20, approximately 20. So you are suggesting inhibiting the potential.
The growth rate is not, it's constant, it's compounded. There's 500 customers doing this at the moment, around 500. We monitor it every month. The statistics go to the board. We're not seeing any inhibition of growth. We're seeing, in fact, we're seeing accelerating growth. So that's the evidence we have. So yeah, that's all I can tell you.
Okay, I have to go to the lady here to put the question for a few minutes now.
Hi, this is about affordability again. With this huge investment, when you spend that lot of money, you've got to claw it back somehow. You're not going to just spend it and not be able to pay it back. So does that imply that prices will be artificially raised to pay back this investment? And are you going to do anything with the COSI tariff so that people who are very vulnerable, the elderly, who aren't awake at 12 o'clock at night and 6 to 6 in the morning, can benefit from this investment, not just the companies which you said you want to encourage and you're giving them a lot of support, but what about the consumer?
Yes, so the real benefit of this project, if the data is correct, is that the yield from this project, we all know on the Isle of Man it's a lot more windy than it is sunny. If you convert that into energy, which is going back to the capacity factor, from the sort of numbers we're seeing at the moment, you get 5 times more energy from your unit of installed wind than you do from solar. So that's a tremendous thing. And we would, the Isle of Man, it's a windy place, that's what we're seeing at the moment. At the sort of figures that we're seeing, bear in mind, if you compare it to what we paid for gas-fired generation for the last 10 years, so before the crisis came, there's been a pretty constant price for gas for, I would say, 10 years. And even through things like the Beast from the East and the nuclear shutdown in Japan, which raised gas prices a lot, even through those major catastrophes, the deviation in price hasn't been that significant. That all changed 2 years ago. We're in a completely different world. It was stratospheric. So if you compare what is the price going forward and this wind farm to what went before, it's probably comparable to where we are now and where we're likely to be in the future, because we're still seeing a lot of volatility. It's not stabilising. This represents a really good, in my opinion, fixed price for a sensible proportion of our energy requirements going forward. This could do maybe a quarter of our electricity demand. And the beauty of putting it on the system in the method that we are proposing is that everybody benefits. Absolutely everybody benefits. It's a one. So included in the price is the funding and the finance and the payback, is what I'm saying. That's exactly the point, and it will be socialised. One of the principles that I think Steve put up was about what they call a just transition of fairness and equity, so that everybody does benefit. So we need to be, it's a difficult balance, but it's a really important principle that we have to apply. So I think we were satisfied with what you were asking for there.
Okay, this lady.
Hello. Nobody's actually mentioned our beautiful island tonight. Nobody's mentioned the fact that we're trying to put 5 wind turbines that are as tall as Blackpool Tower. You can look at the pictures.
They don't show you the roads going to them.
And they don't show you the roads going to them. I'm a great believer in green energy. The cost of this is not free. And this place is an island of democracy. I believe, I don't know what you think, but I think, seeing as everybody's so sure it's such a great idea, why don't we have a referendum on this subject? Just so that we've explored the process fairly and everybody has their say.
Thank you. Could I just say something on this as well, please? Because I think the most important issue in this is actually what you're doing to the island and the landscape, and you're industrialising the landscape. And in every project, that's the major blocker in the UK. There have been hardly any wind turbines built on shore in the last 10 years since they brought the new rules in, which required the community to back them. And no community backed them when they understood the relative damage. And when you talk about pollution, of course there is pollution from hydrocarbons, but there's also pollution from these. And in a different sort, you're polluting and changing the landscape irreversibly. In your Arup report, which hasn't been mentioned anywhere, I haven't seen that, the Arup report actually said that it'd be cheaper for the island to buy renewable energy than to create it or generate it, even with wind. And for some reason, that's sort of been pushed into the long grass. I don't really understand why. I've read that. I've tried to read all of your 20 or more reports that are on the Manx Utility website with thousands and thousands of pages, and heavens knows how much expense. Virtually impossible to do so. But it seems very expensive. You're looking at the price of it. Everybody's talking about, how much is the energy going to cost, or when are you going to pay these things? But you're not looking at the cost to this island of doing that. And if you were doing that in the UK, what they would be saying was that you're setting up a precedent in changing the landscape that's irreversible. What that means is that every future planning decision that looked at it would look at the landscape with termites on it, an industrialised landscape, and that would then be the precedent for any future planning decision. I'm also extremely uncomfortable with the fact that you have the guy who's in charge of environmental policy, who's come up with all this ideological bunkum that is, macro level, global level sort of stuff, not to micro level on the actual island. And he's in charge of planning. And how can you have a fair system? Is he not in charge of planning? I thought he was. But okay, the government's in charge of the planning, the government's developing these wind turbines, the government's pushing the site, it's in charge of DEFRA, it's in charge of Manx Utilities. How can you have a fair system for all of that? And you're talking about bringing industry to the island. When they look at this from the outside in, particularly if you get a legal challenge, and I'm looking at this layers of things that you're doing and you're not doing, or redacted reports, you're highly likely to get a legal challenge on this. And how will that look when they look at some sort of anti-democratic government, or despotic even? I have to be honest, it chills me to the bone to listen to this stuff. It's like Logan's Run. It's like watching Logan's Run, where they decided to kill off all the old people and they thought it was okay. And you're actually looking at all this stuff.
Can we? Okay, are we done? Thank you. Thank you for that. Sorry.
Well, I think there does need a response on that. I think I absolutely understand, of course, that one needs to take care of the countryside. But the government and the people also have to realise that we have a national security issue here in terms of our energy supply for the future. If that energy supply falters or fails, then our future and our children's future and our grandchildren's future will be put into significant doubt. We're working in a landscape that is constantly changing and evolving. Our report it just said put an interconnector in and everything will be alright. But is that truly a responsible way to approach things? And particularly now that the evidence is post-Ukraine, or even during Ukraine, that these cables and these interconnectors are open targets for terrorism, potential terrorism warfare, and certainly for what would now be conventional warfare. I think the government's job, and I think everybody's job, is to really consider how best we can protect the island and move forward, securing both our energy but also our economic. Sorry.
Compensation in government, and you cannot keep the island's lights on with those turbines. You're misrepresenting it. We'll only do about 20%.
Exactly, and I think that for the island, okay, for the Council of Ministers, for the government, and that it is a democratic process. I'll come on to that, one of the other points you raised in a second. You know, the future is not just one power source anymore. It has to be multi-layered, and we have to secure our future by taking the opportunities as they arise. And in this case, you know, the Council of Ministers determined, because we are so far behind the schedule, in a decade, that power station will shut down. And there are many, many risks facing us, and not everything runs smoothly. You talk about democracy, this is one of the very critical points. Absolutely, this is not a done deal. There is a full planning process to go through here. There are lots of statutory consultees, and it is entirely possible, it's entirely possible that this may not get through, in which case...
Please, let's have some order, please. Let's have some order. Thank you. Please.
That's fine. I mean...
Your side had an hour and 15 minutes giving us all this nonsense before. They left it up and they said we've got a time limit till 9 o'clock, which is left 3/4 of an hour to take questions from people.
Okay, let's... Please, okay. Can we move on with... Do you want to say some more?
I do want to, because a lot of points were raised there. I think there is a democratic process that is being followed. There's a planning process that's being followed. And of course, if this fails and falls over, then we're going to have to move on to the next phase. But do you understand, of course, that every year that goes by, more risk is attached to our future energy supply? And I suggest that in doing so, we increase the economic risk to the island, because business will slowly but surely start to get concerned about the island's ability to deliver on its renewable energy commitments, and commitments, by the way, that business, and I would suggest our children, now want us to get on and deliver for the future.
Okay, thank you. We'll move on, please. Lively as we know. Brian, please.
Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah. Well, going back to solar panels there earlier, somebody put them on their house, they paid for it themselves, and I believe the government do give support if you want to put solar panels onto your own property. Is that correct? Just nod will do. Is that correct? No? You get grants, don't you? Well, why, to me, solar panels are part of infrastructure and part of Manx Utilities' responsibility to supply electric. So why don't you put solar panels on people's houses when they want to, and then everybody gets the benefit? Why should he get 9 pence back or whatever? It's part of infrastructure, and it should be looked at that way.
Yeah, so great points. That's exactly what this plan just said. So
come back to me and I'll give you some more ideas. There's 8 billion people in the world, 80,000 population here. The last administration signed up to a contract there to become carbon neutral. We shouldn't have signed up for it. There was no need to sign up for it. We could have done things our way. Absolutely ridiculous.
Okay, there's a gentleman here who's been trying to speak for a while.
Thank you. I'd just like to read out a quote from the House of Keys in October 2013. The MHK at the time said, "Does the Chief Minister not agree with me, though, that before jumping in and committing into 5 wind turbines of such size and scale on the Isle of Man, then presumably setting the precedent for other wind turbines such of size and scale on the Isle of Man to appear? Is that really what we need to have in place? Is this proper thought process, proper pricing, proper structure needed to be in place? What subsidies would be needed in place from landowners, companies to establish these turbines. Therefore, have we rushed into this exercise, into the public domain, before any thought process was given to this? Was it premature? Has it actually made both council and ministers and those representing the local community and some members of Tynwald in general look slightly foolish? Do you know who said that, Mr. Cannon? Can I also say, in your manifesto in 2011, you said you robustly object to on-island wind turbines.
You're absolutely correct, but I mean, I think the situation has evolved considerably since then. And to be fair, there's been a huge number of documents.
So has the island changed? Has our countryside changed? Has our outlook, has our atmosphere on the island, as a countryside, has that all changed?
A number of factors have changed, including the absence.
Your mind. Oh, no. So if you change your mind on this, will you change your mind on something else?
No, I think the situation in terms of the expiry date now of the power station, the change in views around climate change, the fact that the government and many people now on the island accept that we are part of the future success story of changing or slowing down the climate. And we need to do that. It's not just about the personal need, but if we're going to have a future economy, if we're going to have businesses on the island, they are going to want renewable power.
Okay. So does the island at the moment provide any green power?
There is some green power.
So you're already selling to data centres on the island green power. Why can't we bring the rest of the island through the interconnector to do exactly the same? Instead of ruling our
because the current policy is to maximise the renewable energy provision on the island.
Well, you can provide it.
And there's not just wind turbines we're talking about, there are many other potential opportunities that are lining up to try and take advantage of our natural resources.
So what is the advantage of producing it on the island as opposed to buying it where our net zero would be gone and we wouldn't be ruining our countryside?
I think we've seen a number of reasons why, but predominantly because we can create energy security on the island, which will protect future generations. The cost of generating ourselves on the island is far cheaper than putting ourselves exposed to the cost of other people generating it. And because it will help our economy more broadly develop, creating jobs and future security for generations to come. And that's why we have to seriously consider these
Mr. Cannon, we don't
propositions.
We don't have food securities on the island. I mean, our links between the island and England are becoming worse and worse, week by week, day by day. Planes being cancelled, airlines pulling out, the boat can't go because of the wind, so food securities neither. So why are we so hell-bent on electricity and ruining our country?
Because we've seen what happens when war happens now in Europe. We saw the way that the price
is this you coming from your army background with war?
No. But you saw what happened. The government, the taxpayer, had to step in to keep those electricity prices at a sensible level for everybody across the island. You've either now got to accept that we will put our... Well, you're not giving me a chance to talk, so if you're asking a question...
Okay, thank you. This gentleman in front, then the lady over there.
Taking government projects into consideration, like the Liverpool dockyard and the building with the Manxman, you say it's going to cost probably 32 million. Everyone on the island here knows it's going to probably triple. The other thing is, with the wind farm, you're going to get microplastics thrown off the blades. Those microplastics are going to go into the soil. I believe if you get a particular type of wind turbines that produce the microplastics, have got the kind of plastic that's carcinogenic, would that affect the cattle that are grazing on the fields in the south? If those particulates get into the milk system, which goes to Honeyman Creamery, are you going to say to all the farmers in the south, I'm sorry, we're not taking your milk, you've got microplastics in your milk that you're supplying us, we're not going to supply it anymore?
So I'll take that one. the science that you're quoting about microplastics from wind farms is solid science. It definitely isn't. So it's flawed science. There is no science that's been proven that says that's the case. I can hand over to Paul, hopefully. I can only agree with your statement in that sense. There's no evidence of significant quantities of microplastics coming from turbines. Obviously, if the blades were eroding in a significant way to produce a significant amount of plastic, that would effectively be a failure of the turbine blades. And at the moment, we're seeing turbine blades lasting for 30, 35 years consistently, and that's on projects throughout the world. So if there was a considerable erosion of the turbine blade, those blades would be failing, and that's simply not happening.
Okay, thank you. Following on from the microplastics, what about the sound from the turbines themselves, the vibration that we can't actually feel but actually affects the body? I believe the sound goes up to 5 kilometres away, which means people in Castletown, Port Erin and Port St Mary will suffer, and that has been shown to be an effect.
Yes, and again, that's been disproven. I mean, if you look at...
Please, let them speak. This is being recorded, so we can play this back, and if you're lying, then this will be on your...
Please, John to speak.
Okay, like I said, the best example I would say is to consider Eskdalemuir in Scotland, which is the seismographic monitoring station. It's the station that picked up the Russian submarine, I don't know if you remember, that got stuck under the Atlantic. And that's the most sensitive, basically, piece of equipment in, well, I think possibly in the world. There's 3 of them globally, and they're all similar. But effectively, that doesn't pick up vibration from turbines. So whether people can... Sorry?
What frequency? What frequency is it? Does it pick up 17 hertz? Another little hearing, 17 hertz. Up to 6 kilometres away from a station meter.
I mean, the best thing to do, like I say, is, there's no evidence from existing turbines that there's infrasound being produced from those turbines and that it's harming people.
Okay, we're talking about things in science here which we're not too sure. No, please, I've got to go on.
I want to continue with this. If I provide scientific proof, there's scientific proof,
and it's on the internet. You've got lots of different cases where there's you can laugh as much as you like. I'm looking on the internet for these because I can't find them anywhere else, but there's many case studies where you have scientists proving there was one in Australia that went to court and they found it was correct. The science was correct. So if we have these wind turbines put in place and these become a nuisance to all of the people in the area, will the government then pay? Will you pay for the damage? Because as a military man, you might know that infrasound is used to torture, to interrogate people, and I know that's a fact. Okay? It's used. There's no doubt about it. The low frequency that comes off of these wind turbines has that effect.
I live 700 metres from a 14 turbine.
Well, we're going to be 500 metres.
No, like I'm saying, I live 700, it's negligible difference, certainly much closer than 6 kilometres, and no one in the village I live in or in the area I live in has ever complained about any issues resulting from infrasound.
Okay. But I'd just like to move on, the lady in the back here. So, we've got to be very conscious of time as well here. We've got over the allocated time. There's a lady there if you want to speak. Sorry, this gentleman here. And then, lady at the back there. But we're going to have to start thinking about drawing things in as well. Okay?
Hello. Can I ask you to share your views with us on how you perceive local property values to be affected if the scheme goes ahead?
Anybody can answer that?
Good evening. Yes.
Can you do that with 500 metres and 1,000 metres and 2,000 metres, the difference in value is what you perceive there will be at those distances?
I personally can't perceive any difference because I'm not in that business, but it's something that was asked of us earlier on this week, and I think it was in Keys this week or Tynwald the week before, but it's something that we have said we would look at if that was proved to be the case, with those, especially those much closer, if you like. But there is nothing at the moment for us to work with or work on, but as and when there's any evidence of that, we said we would absolutely have a look at that.
And when you say look at it, in what form do you mean? Do you mean some sort of property value guarantee?
We would have to look at all those sorts of things, but yeah, there's nothing there at the moment, but we would look at it.
So,
I'm saying we, that's from the government side, and obviously I'm not with MUA at all now. So.
Sorry, could you just tell me again when that would be?
Well, we actually don't know whether this is going to happen yet. So it's a long way off, I would imagine, a long way off until.
It's already affecting property prices.
But if it doesn't happen, then we won't have this.
You have already affected property prices.
No.
And as Lizzie said earlier today, property prices crashed initially. That is a direct quote that she said this morning. Lots of witnesses in the room. So what are you going to do to compensate somebody who is currently in the situation that they need to sell, or they may want to downsize, or their loan to value on their mortgage has been compromised? What is the government going to do to help those people now?
If that's the case now, we would obviously have to get valuations done and compare them.
Told that is the situation now. So what is the government going to do about it?
No, we can't do anything about it. Sorry.
It's also affecting people's health. A lot of people are worried sick about what's going on.
You can do something, you can stop the whole bloody lot.
Yes,
Thank you. There's a lady at the back there. And then we've got 2 more questions at the end of this, and we're going to have to draw it close.
Good evening. I have an easy question, I hope. I haven't seen anywhere tonight what the heights of the turbines are going to be. I've heard between 150 to 175 metres tall, which is roughly 5 times the height of Hornsway. In Lizzie's presentation, it said that you're not yet clear on how many turbines, and it could be as few as 3. Will that make a difference, and if so, how much to the height of the turbines?
I don't think it's going to make too much difference to the height of the turbines. I think the turbine height, the hub height that we're anticipating is around about 90 metres with a blade diameter or radius of another 60 metres. Yes, I may have got that wrong. But what I was going to go and say is that in terms of the airport and the effect on flights, we have spoken to the airport and looked at how the radars might perceive the turbines. And the thing that with the designs that we're looking at the moment is that they would stay beneath the ridge level of the hill that's behind them. So in fact the radar wouldn't perceive them. So there is an issue if you go too much higher with the turbines, or you move away and further up the hill.
Okay, thank you. This lady over here.
Thank you very much. Lots and lots of people have raised a lot of often very genuine concerns about the plans going forward. And obviously there's a lot of feeling in this room. I'm 27, I'm facing a future that is potentially devastating, worldwide crisis. And while a lot of the things that we're talking about are massively important for this incredible Isle of Man that we live on, so is a world crisis. And my question is kind of to the whole room, but I would appreciate an answer is, what are the risks of not taking action? What are the risks to us in our lifetimes and to us in future generations of not taking action, no matter what that might be? Thank you.
think that is a political question. I'm happy to answer. I think we would be failing the generations to come by not delivering on our opportunities for self-security and maximising our potential when it comes to renewable energy on this island.
Declare an interest, please, because you're the daughter of an MLC. Declare your interest to the room.
Go on then.
Mr. Craig.
I'm an architect and Steve Browder. I've got a lot of environmental projects that I'm involved in, so I'd like to think I've got plenty of credentials in terms of the environment. But my problem is that it isn't just this, it's other projects across the island, and what we tend to see, as expressed by the lady over here, is that they're engineering driven, not thought driven, not design driven. And the major concern is that we're looking at a project here, and because as an architect, and as I say, I've got a first affordable eco house out there which is under evaluation at the current time. Projects which are involved right now on retrofitting existing homes. The problem is they don't well for the MUA, because obviously they'll reduce your energy requirement, reduces your income. Good thing for the environment, not a good thing for the MUA. The challenge is, at the moment, that the industry that we're working in is pushing forward rapidly on new technology, which was all mentioned in the slides about smart technology. So retrofitting homes and new build, which is passive house with plus, so it's putting carbon back into the system. That is the way forward at the current time. There's no need to run to... I see the formula as to dependency, but other people are pointing out that environmentally it would just be far better to acquire our energy from other sources and across, without doubt. And the major aspects in terms of going forward, in terms of retrofitting homes, is that we have such an opportunity at this current time. So we're looking at, as we've estimated, probably in the region of 50, 60 million by the time we're finished. Only have to look at Liverpool. Yeah, possibly, but the point is, if we reinvest that money on our current homes, you could all be looking at 3,000 or 4,000 or 5,000 each for an environmental retrofit. And there's technology at the moment that will literally halve your energy usage due to heat recovery, which is a major aspect, not just insulation. Real lack of understanding. And the key point that I have here about the climate transformation group is that unfortunately there's been real lack of contact. I've got plumbers and fitters out there with no idea what's happening. We're right at the crux of December now, and in January the 1st we're supposed to be involved with no fossil fuel fittings for boilers, or projects approved. Where are we going? We've completely lost our way here. We really have quite a challenging situation, and it's not been addressed with the nice slides. We're really in a very difficult situation. So can you tell me, how you could better use that money in terms of investment at the current time instead of carving up our environment? It's foolish.
So, you're absolutely right, we just run electricity. So what I can tell you actually, we support energy efficiency in a really big way. We have an energy efficiency officer. We have a lot of material to help people reduce their carbon footprint and improve their, reduce their bills. So what's happened in the last 10 years to our demand? It's gone down every year. Every single year, maybe 1% a year at least. We're looking to the future and we're all wondering what's going to happen, and we're seeing electric vehicles, we're seeing heat pumps, and maybe that will swing around. We don't know. We're running lots of different scenarios at the moment, and we don't really know for sure how that's going to apply to the old man. I'm not a passive house or even a heating strategist to any extent at all. What I can tell you is that I'm aware that next year there will be a heating strategy for our van housing stock and beyond. And I can't tell you any more about that. I'm not part of it, but I can ask around and try and get you some information.
I do agree with you. The challenge is that it's that little circle in the middle of the page, isn't it, which says net zero 2030. And, you know, people have been critical about the UK, but they've smelled the coffee. Because we all understand it in the industry. There's nobody here in the room who's got better environmental credentials. So what I'm saying to you is we need to be adaptable. And it's a sad shame that we've got real potential to do things differently and use our money and invest it better than the way we're just talking at the moment. I recognise the project, but what you haven't committed on that programme is how much money you've had to commit at the current time. I mean, the procurement is a huge period of time. Surely we've had to put deposits down and put our name down, and that money's not recoverable. That's not been talked about this evening.
Okay.
Just quickly, but
okay,
well
understood. So that's not true. There's no money down. There's no. It was mentioned. Yeah, absolutely. There wasn't an initial risk. It was recognised as a risk.
Other than the EIA,
we've done a lot of work with the potential manufacturers to work out how that may play out eventually, and that's not a risk currently that we're.
Other than the EIA.
Okay, EIA. Absolutely.
We're going to have to wind up. The final question here. I must display it at the back. It's just you put your hand up? Yeah.
I just wanted to ask about the planning. You said the planning, it would go to planning, it might not happen. But is there not a move afoot for government-owned sites? If it's rejected at planning, it goes to COMID rather than to an independent inspector, which would give you, it would just pass something that's on your ground.
Well, so it may well go to an independent inspector who would then go out and hold a full public inquiry into.
So you need to make sure that happened in this case, because there's obviously enough feeling in the room that it can't possibly go to COMID.
So it would go to an independent. What would happen when it would go to an independent inspector under the current existing law? It would go to an independent inspector. They'd have a public inquiry. That inspector would then compile their report, make their recommendations, and that would be then presented to the Council of Ministers. So that is the absolute position. So there's absolute integrity in the process, and there's no difference. In terms, okay, well you need to change the law then, but that is the process. So there would be a full inspector's inquiry, which would give every member of the public the chance, every stakeholder in terms of their interests, a chance to come along and present their case.
So you're not trying to change that?
No, I don't think so at the moment. It's the process in place at the moment, and if it was to change, as you just said, the law would have to change. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we've probably exhausted time. People are leaving. I'd like to thank you very much for attending this public meeting tonight. It's been very useful, I'm sure, for the public and the MUA, the ministers and the specialists all here this evening. Again, thank you very, very much. Please drive carefully home, and I'm sure we'll all see you at the next meeting, which I'm sure will be. See you later. Thank you.